Hello, everyone. Welcome to my session at the Fest of Tech Calendar 2022. My name is Seif Bassem. I'm a Senior Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft. You can find me on Twitter or on my personal blog. Today, I'm very happy to talk to you about a very interesting topic, which is how to build Azure, but outside of Azure. And before I start talking about this topic, I'd like to just explain why and in what scenarios do you need to build Azure outside of Azure or use Azure Arc. So if we take a step back and we start exploring the current landscape across customers, you can see on the far right that most customers, if not all customers, have hybrid and or a multi-cloud strategy. So lots of customers still have some workloads that live on premises. And also a lot of customers are considering having different cloud providers. So they would have resources hosted on Azure, on AWS, on GCP, and other types of clouds. And at the same time, within this infrastructure, you would see different scenarios like edge locations where you would need some compute at retail stores in air-gapped locations. You would have some partners that you're hosting in. So again, a lot of diverse types of infrastructure that customers own, and this is necessary for their business to keep going. And on top of all of that, there are the applications which power lots of the businesses at the moment. And as you can see, there are lots and lots of different types of applications and workloads that customers would host, ranging from virtual machines, containers, databases, serverless, and taking it a step further, on top of that, lots of frameworks and libraries that they're using to build their applications. So with that, there is a very set of challenges and questions that needs to be answered. So given that diverse set of infrastructure, how I'm going to govern and secure and manage all of this infrastructure from a single pane of glass? How will I ensure the security of my application workloads and infrastructure across all of this infrastructure and all of those cloud providers, without needing to learn and deploy and manage and upskill on different security tools at different providers? Also, how can we simplify the tasks of our developers, simplify their lives in terms of providing a more agile environment and have them just focus on the tools that they're always using and forget about where their application is being hosted? And also, how do we overcome latency problems? So for scenarios where customers need to have millisecond transactions without going to the cloud, or they don't have a reliable internet connection, how do we enable those kinds of scenarios and those workloads? And finally, how do we meet regulatory requirements across all of this infrastructure? So if I have workloads deployed on Azure, on Google Cloud, on AWS, and I need to have the PCI certification if I'm a financial in the financial sector, how do I enforce and at the same time measure compliance across those clouds without the need to be able to learn multiple tools on different clouds? And the reporting, of course, it's going to be a hassle. So with all of that being said, we can talk about what Azure Arc is now. So Azure Arc is a layer that sits on top of all of this, all of the infrastructure that I have, and it provides this single pane of glass or single control plane across all of my infrastructure. So it allows me to answer those questions and to have this single pane of glass in terms of management, security, governance, and also enabling our developers to develop using the tools that they love and deploy anywhere without worrying about learning new skills. So today I'm just going to talk about three main concepts or three main functionalities around Azure Arc. So we're going to talk about how to organize, secure, and govern across environments. So you might have different Windows, Linux servers, Kubernetes clusters, SQL servers deployed across a diverse set of infrastructure. How do we organize, secure, and govern them from one place? And then also we're going to talk about at-scale Kubernetes application management. So again, you might have a fleet of Kubernetes cluster, maybe on Azure, maybe on Google Cloud, maybe on AWS, maybe on premises. And again, you'd like to enable your developers to deploy and be more agile using those clusters, but again, providing this consistent experience and management interface. And finally, we're going to talk about running data services anywhere. So again, with the example about latency and air-gapped locations, sometimes we would need some data services deployed for certain applications or even doing machine learning. And with this type of slow or non-existent internet connection, we would need to have data services there to be able to support our application. So those are the main three themes that we're gonna explore together today. So Azure Arc provides different types of services, as we've explained, above the infrastructure or the fabric layer. So you can see at the bottom the different types of infrastructure that we have. So we have cloud providers, we have on-premises platforms like VMware, Azure Stack HCI. And on top of that, Azure Arc provides two types of services. There are Arc-enabled infrastructure, and there are Arc-enabled services. So with Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure, you already have the infrastructure, you already have Windows servers, you already have Linux, you already servers, you already have Kubernetes clusters. And what you need to do is that you would need to bring Azure to those services or this kind of infrastructure. You'd like to be able to protect those this infrastructure using, say, Defender for Cloud. You'd like to monitor your Kubernetes cluster or Windows servers using Azure Monitor. You'd like to apply policy across all of those resources across clouds and hybrid. So this is with Azure Arc enabled infrastructure, this allows you to project those services into Azure as if they are first citizen Azure resources. So we're not moving, we're not migrating. The resources are either in your data center or they are on other clouds, but you can see them in the Azure portal. You can apply policies to them. You can apply tags. You can manage them using Azure services without them leaving your data center. The other type of services that Azure Arc provides is Azure Arc enabled services, which is, if you think about it, it's the other way around. So instead of projecting resources to Azure, we're actually pushing and deploying Azure services in your infrastructure. So imagine that you have your application team. They're fond of Azure functions. They like to use it, but for some workloads, those workloads cannot simply be deployed outside your data center or specific cloud provider. So instead of having to compromise, Azure Arc enables you to actually deploy Azure functions and use it inside your data center or even on Google Cloud or AWS, so that you would give your developers the same consistent experience, platform as a service experience that they would expect from a cloud provider, but all of this is deployed on your infrastructure, regardless of where that is. So today we're going to talk about a mix of both types of services, Arc-enabled infrastructure and Arc-enabled services. So the themes that we're going to talk about today is developing cloud native and operate anywhere, harness data and insights from cloud to edge, secure and govern across environments, and flexibility, meeting regulatory and connectivity needs. So those are the highlight features of Azure Arc. So today I'm just gonna dive deep into some of them and give you examples on how to use Azure Arc to achieve this this kind of feature and service from Azure Arc. And we're gonna have a demo on some of those services so that you can visualize how this would take place and how this would look like on your infrastructure. So first, let's start with develop cloud native and operate anywhere. So nowadays, everyone is moving to containers. Everyone is adopting Kubernetes, given the way that it orchestrates the containers and it gives the flexibility and agility in terms of quickly deploying applications anywhere. So with Azure Arc, we try to provide a modern way to deploy cloud-native apps on any Kubernetes cluster that you have that is supported. So obviously on Azure, there is the Azure Kubernetes service, but maybe you want to deploy this application not just on Azure, but you would like to deploy it on GCP, on the Google Kubernetes engine. So your developers would have to learn Google Kubernetes engine. They would have to learn Azure Kubernetes service so that they're able to deploy their applications on both clouds. So with Azure Arc, what we provide is we provide the developers with a consistent way to deploy their application and configuration to their cluster, regardless of where they sit. And this is done using GitOps and policy-driven deployment. And I have a very cool demo to show you how this would work. Another thing is bringing cloud data management to any infrastructure. So from the app side, we're talking about Kubernetes and GitOps, but what about the data? So each application would need some data. So you have a couple of options. Maybe you would use the different data services for each cloud provider that you're using. So on each cloud, you'd have a different data service, which might not be ideal. Or you can provide your developers with a managed Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance service, which is a PaaS service that is deployed on Azure, but you can take this and you can deploy it everywhere else. So with this type of approach, you would have the consistency. You would give your developers the consistency of data services that they're working on their application, instead of having to interface and work and learn with different data services. So we have Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance, and we have Azure Arc enabled PostgreSQL as well. And we're going to talk about this in details. So for this specific pillar, we're going to mainly focus on Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. And with this service, what we do with Azure Arc is that you can bring any supported Kubernetes distribution that you're using, and you can see at the bottom there are lots and lots of supported Kubernetes clusters. And what you need to do is just connect or onboard your Kubernetes cluster to Azure Arc using a very simple CLI command. And once you do this, you're going to see this Kubernetes cluster projected in the Azure portal as if it's an Azure resource. And it allows you to monitor this Kubernetes cluster using container insights on Azure. You can protect this Kubernetes cluster with Defender for containers. You can apply Azure policy to make sure you're governing and applying all of your regulatory requirements across your Kubernetes clusters. You can, of course, apply tags. You can deploy open service mesh. You can do lots and lots of things. So talking about Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, let's see a demo to see how this would look like. So let me switch quickly to my demo. And here I'm in the Azure portal, and I'm in the Azure Arc Azure Arc landing page. And here I'm gonna go to see my Kubernetes clusters that are being deployed. And actually, let me jump here quickly. Yeah, and let me show you the two Kubernetes clusters that I have. So here I have two Kubernetes cluster that I've connected to Azure Arc. One of them is cluster API cluster, and the other one is a Rancher cluster, and both of them are on-prem Kubernetes cluster. So you can see I have different distribution of Kubernetes cluster, but here in Azure, I can see them projected as if they are an Azure resource. And if I click on one of those clusters, you can see that I get lots of information about the Kubernetes version, the agent version, and I have the same experience that I would have if I'm deploying Azure Kubernetes service. So I have the namespaces, I have the workloads, I can look at the storage configuration. So it's as if it's an Azure resource. And the cool thing about Azure Arc Kubernetes is that it allows me to deploy extensions to my Kubernetes cluster to add additional features and capabilities. So you can see here that I have the Azure Key Vault secrets provider, and I'm going to demonstrate how to use this. You can see I'm deploying Flux, Open Service Mesh, Azure Policy, Azure Monitor, and Defender for containers. So all of those additional cloud capabilities, I can bring them to my Kubernetes clusters anywhere using Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes. So before going into the application deployment part, let me just show you the Defender part. So you can see here, for example, that I have this cluster onboarded. Defender for containers is already enabled. If I have any recommendations from a security configuration perspective, they are going to appear here for my cluster. You can see that I have alerts, security alerts on my cluster, and I can, the same experience that you would expect from Defender for Cloud. I can click on the alert. I can see, let me drill down. I can see more information about this alert. And this can help me troubleshoot and help me harden my Kubernetes cluster. So this types of insights are going to be surfaced regardless of where your Kubernetes cluster is located, even if it's outside of Azure. So this is one of the really powerful capabilities that Azure Arc brings to Kubernetes. Another really useful thing is monitoring. So if you're deploying again in different locations, you might have different tools. On premises, you might be using some Kubernetes monitoring solutions. On another cloud, you would use their own monitoring solution. But here you have a consistent experience from monitoring. So I have monitoring insights enabled. I can see the node utilization from CPU, from memory. I can also see the health of the nodes that I have. And I can drill down to get more information about the containers and the processes that are running on my Kubernetes clusters. And also, which is very cool, I can see all of the containers that are running on my Kubernetes clusters, and I can even get the logs out of those containers. So I can go to log analytics, and I can see the logs and the events that are happening on those containers. So this really abstracts the monitoring functionality regardless of where my Kubernetes cluster is, or even what distribution my Kubernetes cluster is using. So with that said, let me just jump into my demo. So what I have here is that I have a Kubernetes and an application that is, So I have an application that I've deployed to my Kubernetes cluster. It's just a very hello world type of application. And this application I've deployed using GitOps. So I have a GitHub repository where I have the application, and I'm going to show you how I used Azure Arc to link and do the handshake between my repository and this Kubernetes cluster. So if I go back to my Azure Portal, and if I go to GitOps, you're going to see that I have different configuration and application that I've already linked to my Kubernetes cluster, which is on premises. So here I'm going to open this GitOps configuration, and you can see that this is my repository where I have my application deployed. So with this, I have a GitHub repository. I have my application, and actually let me open the GitHub repository. I can see my Hello Arc application deployed. I can see the Helm charts. I can see the YAML files of my application. You can see here the message that appears on my application. So what I'm going to do is that to demonstrate how this would look like, in terms of providing the agility for developers, I'm going to go to my repository and I'm going to change this message, and I'm going to show you how this would look like in real time. So if let me just So what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to get the pods of this application, and I'm going to show you in real time once I'm changing this message on GitHub, what's going to happen here. So let's jump to our repository, and I'm going to do a direct edit here, and I'm going to say, welcome to Festive Tech Calendar 2022. And I'm going to commit directly to main. Of course, not a good practice, but just to demonstrate. And jumping back here to my application, you can see directly, since GitOps is configured using Azure Arc, you can see that my containers are being terminated. A new container is being deployed given the new changes that happened on the repository. And if I simply refresh, you can see that my application has directly updated to reflect the new message. So thinking about this for a sec, I have a Kubernetes cluster that is on premises. If I'm a developer, I'm using GitHub to enhance my application. I did not have to learn anything new. I'm still working on GitHub to update my code. And from an infrastructure or from an infrastructure team perspective, we applied this GitOps configuration using Azure Arc, and I can apply this. Sorry, let me open the right page. I can apply this. I can enforce this using Azure policy so that all of my containers get the same consistent configuration, and I'm pushing those configuration to my GitHub repo, and automatically my Kubernetes, my fleet of Kubernetes clusters are going to get updated with the necessary configuration or the changes to my application. So this is one example of the power of Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. Another demo that I'm going to show is we've talked about the Key Vault extension, and Kubernetes, of course, has its own secrets implementation where you can manage and secure secrets. But here I'd like to use Azure Key Vault. If you're using Azure Key Vault in Azure and you'd like to standardize across environments, so here you can see that my website is being protected by a certificate. So let me stop the auto refresh. And if I open this certificate, let's see the fingerprint of this certificate. So I can see this is the fingerprint of the certificate, and I'm going to show you that this certificate actually lives in Key Vault, and I've deployed this using Key Vault. So if let me go back to the Azure portal, and let me go to Key Vault. And of course, I need to grant myself access. So I'm just gonna quickly I just need get and list. And I'm gonna grant myself access to be able to read the certificates. So here you can see that in Key Vault, I have one certificate, and you can see this is the same thumbprint that we saw in our application. And using Azure Arc and the Key Vault extension, I'm able to extend my Kubernetes cluster to seamlessly use Azure Key Vault to store certificates and maybe key secrets and keys as well. So this is another very cool capability of Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. So the last thing that I'm going to show you with Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes is the open service mesh. And open service mesh is something that allows you to control and monitor networking rules across your clusters. And what I'm going to do here is, let me just close this application. And let me open a different application that I have for you. So with open service mesh, I have a bookstore application. And with this bookstore application, I have two versions of this application. And using Open Service Mesh, I have all of my traffic directed to version 1. As you can see, lots of visitors on version 1. Version 2, I have no visitors. I'm going to use Open Service Mesh to direct only 70% of my traffic, 75% of my traffic to V1 and 25% of my traffic to V2. So this is like a blue-green deployment model where I just want to test the new version, and then I can directly completely direct the traffic to V2 when I'm happy with the results. So let me open. Okay. So this is the V2 and this is V1. So let me do some formatting to make sure it's clear. I'm gonna close this and I'm gonna close this. Okay, so the last thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just show you how this appears in kubectl as well for demonstration. So let me open this and let me run this. So here you can see that I'm still using V1, nothing is directed towards V2. So what I'm gonna do, again, I'm gonna go to my repository and change the configuration on the GitHub repo to be able to change the traffic there. So again, this is through GitOps. So GitOps does not only deploy application, but you can deploy configuration as well. So I'm going to go to Bookstore and I'm going to go to my YAML file and I'm going to go to Bookbuyer. Sorry, let me go to OSM and go to traffic split. So here you can see that, again, I have Bookstore V1, V2. You can see that the weight is 100 on the V1 so that all of the traffic is directed there. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just change this to be 75 to 25. And again, I'm going to commit directly to main. And now if I get back here, let's monitor this command prompt. So it's still saying V1, but here you can see that V2 started to appear. So that means that traffic is starting to flow to my V2. And you can see also that the other tabs started to pick up. So you can see some traffic is being forwarded to V2, and this is about 25% of my total traffic. And I can see here that my V2 is running. People are working with it. Books are being sold from V2. And then I can keep monitoring the performance and the user experience. And then if I'm satisfied with the result, I can change this to switch completely to V2. So this is, again, another very cool capability to drive more innovation and more agility to your developers without introducing the complexity of multi-cloud and hybrid Kubernetes for them. So with that said, let me go back to my slides and let's visit another topic with Azure Arc. So now we've covered the application side using Kubernetes. So let's talk a little bit about how to work with data in locations where latency is intolerable, there is no internet connection or very slow internet connection, or if you have regulatory requirements that the data cannot leave your data center or it cannot leave your cloud provider, the public or private cloud provider. So we would need this kind of situation where, again, as I've talked about, latency and regulatory requirements, but also imagine a retail store where would love to run AI capabilities and machine learning capabilities at the store to be able to, for example, give recommendations to their users. And this is something that a lot of retail stores would consider to have infrastructure, very, very low footprint infrastructure at their stores to be able to provide this split-second capabilities to their users. So with this, Azure Arc provides 3 types of data services at the moment that you can deploy outside of Azure. So if you've worked with Azure, you definitely know Azure Arc enabled SQL, Azure SQL managed instance, you know Azure Postgres, and of course Azure machine learning. So with Azure Arc, you can take those managed platform as a services and take them and deploy them outside of Azure. So revisiting the retail store, I can have like an Azure Stack HCI one node, I can have any type of infrastructure there, and I can simply deploy Azure Arc SQL managed instance on this infrastructure so that my developers would not have to deploy SQL, patch SQL, maintain SQL. All they need to do is have a managed data service. So they would Azure would take care of patching this and upgrading this managed instance. You get cloud billing. You don't actually need to worry about anything apart from your data. So the 2 offerings that are available are Arc-enabled SQL managed instance and Arc-enabled PostgreSQL. And on top of those data services, you might need to do some machine learning. And if you cannot do this on the cloud, again, for latency, for regulatory requirements, you can actually deploy and train models using Azure Arc on any kind of infrastructure. So the main value of running data services, Azure Arc enabled data services, is having an always up-to-date data service. So again, it's the same experience as you get with Azure SQL managed instance on Azure. You get automated updates. If you've worked with SQL Server, you know how much of effort and planning you need in terms of upgrading a SQL Server. And again, if it's in a cluster, it's a lot of work. With Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance and Postgres, you get almost zero downtime and upgrades that can happen in a matter of seconds or minutes instead of hours or sometimes days. You also get multi-layer security, so you're able to get apply Azure RBAC, Azure policy, use some of the cloud capabilities like encryption and auto-rotation of keys. You can also get the benefits of the cloud with elastic scale. This can be a little bit challenging with the standard version or the default version of SQL Server, whether it's enterprise or standard. With Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance, you're able to scale up and down. It's based on Kubernetes, so it's very fast, it's very scalable. And one of the main benefits is pay for what you use. So you get cloud billing on Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance. Instead of just paying licenses for SQL, you actually pay for what you use in terms of cores and instances that you're deploying. And again, you get this kind of billing on your premise. So you can have a VMware infrastructure on your premises, and you can deploy Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance, and you would only pay for what you use. As we've talked about Azure Arc enabled machine learning, again, using Azure Arc, you can Arc enable a Kubernetes cluster, and this can act as a target for Azure machine learning. So instead of building and deploying models in the cloud, you can actually build those models and have your Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster as a target so that those models would run and train and validate and deploy on your infrastructure. So you gain the power of Azure machine learning, but again, you're abiding to your regulatory requirements and your different scenarios that would need this to be deployed in your data center. So with that said, let's take a look on how this would look like in real life. So let me switch back and let me go to, Let me go to the Azure portal. And now I'm still in the Azure Arc landing page. And here you can see that I've selected SQL managed instance. And you can see that I have 3 different Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance. Let me just click on one of them just to show you how this would look like and the ease that you would get this. So with the only thing, since this is a managed service, there are a couple of things that I can do and I can control. So of course, I can select the service tier where I'd like to deploy my Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance. There are two tiers, general purpose and business critical. You can see there are differences in terms of resources, and also there are high availability capabilities that are only available in business critical. I can select the number of replicas for high availability. Again, if I'm using business critical, I can configure readable secondaries. And of course, I can configure the compute power of my instance. So this is basically what I configure when I'm creating Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance. And that's mainly it. Everything else is mainly streamlined as if I'm deploying in Azure. So here, for example, you see the upgrades. If I have upgrades, I'm going to see the versions that are upgraded, and I can configure automatic upgrade, or I can click upgrade manually. And since it's based on Kubernetes, pods are going to be deleted and pods are going to be created. So again, upgrading SQL is now a matter of seconds and minutes. So it's very, very agile in terms of providing data services to your users. So let me jump to another machine and let me show you how the experience would look like. So I have another application, the bookstore application that is deployed, and the backend of this application is Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance. So here you can see I have 4 books that are in my bookstore. So let me show you how the backend would look like. So I have 2 options. I can connect using the famous SQL Management Studio, or I can use the Azure Data Studio as well. So for DBAs out there, you're using the same tools that you're accustomed to. You don't have to learn any new tools to interact and work with Azure Arc enabled data services. So here I'm going to open the SQL managed instance that I've deployed, and I'm deploying my application database to it. So I'm expanding the databases. This is my database that I have, and I'm going to just run a select query to show you the books that I have. And you can see those are the 4 books that I have on my application. So again, I have an application deployed on Kubernetes. I have Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance. My developers would simply leverage this managed data service to deploy a more cloud native type of applications, again, outside of Azure. So one of the cool things that are available here, let me show you. I'm going to just get the connection string for my cluster. Is that the support of Active Directory authentication. So if I'm using Active Directory in my normal SQL Server and I'm deploying Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance, I can still use Windows authentication using Active Directory. So this allows me to use my existing security groups and policies, password policies, to secure access to my SQL managed instance. So here I'm going to connect. And again, you can see the same type of interface that DBAs are accustomed to. And again, let me just select the top rows. And again, I'm going to see the 4 books that I have deployed. So all of this is very cool to use if you're trying to adopt cloud native. As you can see, it's very simple to deploy. Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance. There is not much to do in terms of provisioning and managing because, again, it's a managed service. So that's the beauty of the service. The last thing that I'm going to show you is Azure Arc enabled data services includes Grafana, the open source Grafana dashboards to allow you to visualize and monitor your Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance. So you can use Azure Monitor, you can use Log Analytics, but if you're accustomed to using Grafana, this comes out of the box, and you can see here I have some dashboards configured. I can see the CPU percentage, I can see the transactions per second, and I have lots of visualizations that I get out of the box. So this is just a sample of what you would expect from Azure Arc enabled data services, specifically SQL managed instance. Okay, let me jump back to the slides. And now let's talk about the other theme, the third theme that we have, which is secure and govern across environments. So again, from the first slide that we've talked about, we've discussed that you might have a fleet of Windows servers, Linux servers, SQL servers, Kubernetes clusters everywhere in your infrastructure, whether it's Azure, AWS, Google, Azure Stack HCI, VMware, System Center, Virtual Machine Manager, absolutely everywhere. So you would need to, again, have a single pane of glass. You would need to have this single control plane to manage, monitor, secure, and govern those resources. Instead of having to learn Azure Monitor for Azure resources, on premises, you would use something like SCOM. On AWS, you would use another monitoring solution. So lots and lots of different tools to learn and manage and consolidate. So with Azure Arc enabled infrastructure, you're able to connect your servers, Windows or Linux. You're able to connect your SQL servers, and also you're able, as we've discussed, to connect Kubernetes clusters. And in preview as well, you're able to Arc-enabled VMware vSphere virtual machines, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. So again, with the other diagrams that we've looked at, you have this infrastructure layer that you can have whatever that you would like, whatever that you have now on infrastructure of your choice, AWS, VMware, Google, and then Azure Arc comes and sits on top of that to give you this single pane of glass. Here you can also see some famous Azure services like Defender for Cloud, Sentinel, Azure Monitor, Azure Policy. And as you can see, Azure Arc brings those services to you. So you might not be able to use them if you're on maybe on another cloud or on premises. But now you can actually do that without migrating those services or resources to Azure. You can simply bring those Azure services to you. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is Azure Arc enabled servers. And all you need to do is simply install an agent. While you onboard your servers to Azure Arc, an agent gets installed, and those servers can be virtualized, or they can even be bare metal physical servers. So once you connect or onboard those servers, you get a lot of benefits. So first, you get the ability to deploy virtual machine extensions. If you're using Azure, those are simply, you can run, you can deploy a script on all of your VMs using extensions. So now this is extended outside of Azure. You can have like a PowerShell script, and you can deploy it using extension, and it's going to deploy on all of your virtual machines, whether they are Azure, on-prem, other clouds. Also, you get centralized management. So we've talked about Azure Monitor. You can also do update management across all of your Arc-enabled servers. You can use Auto-Manage, which is a very cool new service that allows you to bundle configuration to your servers. You can also use change tracking, inventory, and lots of the famous Azure services on your Arc-enabled servers. In terms of governance, you can, of course, apply tags. You can apply Azure policies to make sure to govern your infrastructure. You can also use guest configuration policies. So imagine a situation where you have a requirement from the security team to have the password policy to be, for example, 30 days. So if you have your on-prem servers, maybe you're using group policy. If you have other servers that are not joined to the domain on AWS, you would think about deploying a script or doing something else, or a configuration management solution. But with Azure Arc, you have Azure policies where you can just apply a policy, and this policy is going to apply to your infrastructure regardless of where they are. So you have one place to apply your policies and govern your servers, and this is going to cascade everywhere else. And finally, security. So with Azure Arc enabled servers, this allows you to deploy Defender for Cloud, so you can protect your servers. You can do vulnerability assessment on your servers. You can also deploy Windows Server baselines, security baselines. You can apply RBAC. And also, a very useful thing is if those servers need to connect to Azure services, maybe Key Vault, maybe any other type of managed service like a SQL, Azure SQL or something, Azure Arc allows you to have a managed identity for this server. So this allows you to securely access Azure PaaS services from your hybrid and multi-cloud servers. Another thing is SQL Server. So if any of those servers have SQL installed, Azure Arc allows you to be able to manage those SQL servers, again, if they are on Azure or outside of Azure. And you get this SQL assessment service. So you get a dashboard in Log Analytics. It assesses continuously your SQL servers against performance, against high availability, upgradability, and it gives you basically an on-demand assessment service on your SQL servers. And of course, governance with Azure Policy and recently announced Defender for Cloud. So you can get the Defender for Cloud protection for SQL on your resources that sit outside of Azure. And one very cool feature that was just announced while I was preparing for this session is pay-as-you-go billing. So if you have SQL deployed on premises or on a VM on other cloud, you pay for an enterprise or standard license. But now, if this SQL Server is onboarded to Azure Arc, you're able to switch to pay-as-you-go billing, even if this is on premises, which is very, very cool. So if your VM that has SQL is not turned on, you're not going to pay anything. So it's a very, very cool new feature to explore. I've mentioned also Arc-enabled VMware vSphere VMs, and this is a preview feature. This allows you to connect your vSphere environment to Azure Arc. And the benefit of doing so is that it allows you to manage the full VM lifecycle from Azure. So imagine that you have a couple of VMware deployments in different data centers around the world. If you'd like to give your developers a way to create virtual machines, ideally, this would have to pass by the infrastructure team. They would have to get the specs from the developers and provision a VM and give them access, and it hinders the agility and the velocity that the developers would need. So with this kind of solution, the developers would create virtual machines from the Azure portal. They would see the templates that the infra team has made available to them. They see the specs and again, they are allowed to deploy, and they go to the Azure portal, create a new VM, and this VM gets created on your VMware infrastructure on-prem or in another cloud, which is very cool, and I'm going to show you a demo of that. And this also allows the developer to bundle up the infrastructure with their application. So they can do Terraform, they can use Bicep or ARM templates to create those VMs. Again, those VMs can be on VMware, on AWS, or on premises. So it's very cool to be able to provision this kind of infrastructure within their application, which give them the velocity and the agility that they would need. So with that said, let's jump back into the Azure portal and let me show you how this would look like in real life. So let me go back to our favorite Azure landing page. And here I'm going to open servers. And I'm going to select, you can see I have different Arc-enabled servers available that are connected. And here you can see I have, let me just select a different server. So this server, for example, you can see from the tags, it lives on VMware. So it's on-prem and it lives on VMware. If I select another server, let me see, I think I had one on AWS. Yeah, and this you can see this one is on AWS. So you can see I have a diverse set of servers deployed everywhere. And once I connect this to Azure Arc, you can see that I have I have some metadata about those servers. So I see the operating system version. I can see the tags that I've applied. And then I get the additional features that I've talked about. So for example, here, Defender for Cloud, I see the recommendations that Defender for Cloud would detect or the misconfiguration that it would detect on my servers, and it gives me recommendations. So I can see also if I have any alerts. I can also see the extension and deploy extensions as we've discussed. So I can, if I'd like to deploy a script on all my infrastructure, I can just simply do a custom script extension for Linux. Here it's going to be a bash script, of course, and I can simply upload the script, and it's going to run on all my Arc-enabled servers. And I can do this using Terraform. I can use this using PowerShell or Azure CLI. Another thing that we've talked about is Azure policy. So here I can assign policies to my Azure servers. Again, they can be policies which target guest operating system configuration, and I can see the compliance across all of my Arc servers from the same place. I can also do patch management. Again, if I have some servers on-prem, and on-prem I don't have a patching solution for Linux, Arc can cover this for me. Once onboarded to Azure Arc, I can use the Azure Update Management solution to check for updates and have deployment schedules for the criteria of updates. I need the schedule where I would like to deploy those updates. So it's a very, very extensible solution to give superpowers to your infrastructure. I can also get inventory of all of the packages and software that lives on my servers. I can see the files. I can track specific files, specific registry keys. So as you can see here, I get an inventory of all of the packages that is on this Ubuntu server. I can also do change tracking. So maybe I'd like to monitor what kind of software has been installed in the past 24 hours. Maybe something went wrong, so I just need to track this. I can write log analytics query to be able to query this kind of information. So I can track files, I can track changes for registry keys. So in this case, daemons for Linux. So here you can see, I can see the properties of this daemon. I can see also the change. So the value was running, but now it has stopped. So as you can see, this is very useful to be able to understand what happened on my servers. Another cool thing that we can do is Azure Monitor. So again, if I don't have a monitoring solution across my diverse infrastructure, once onboarding to Azure Arc, I can simply enable virtual machine insights, and I would directly get very useful visualizations around my CPU utilization, around my memory, the disk networking. All of this I get out of the box. I don't need to build any visualization myself. And also, finally, I can see also the dependency map. So I can see which processes run on this server and what kind. Actually, let me show you another server that can have more dependencies. So let me go back to the map. Yes. So as you can see here, I get this visualization map that shows me my server, the clients that are connecting to it, and the connections that are initiated from my server. So here you can see that I'm connecting to port 137, and I can expand to understand which server I'm connecting to, and I can see if this connection has been established or it's blocked. So this is very useful to troubleshoot networking issues on my Arc-enabled servers. The last thing that I wanted to show you here is a preview feature, which is Windows Admin Center. So again, this server lives on Hyper-V on my laptop, and what I can do is from the Azure Portal, after Arc enabling the server, I can connect to this server using the Windows Admin Center without opening any inbound firewall port, which is very, very cool. So I can have a lockdown server, no inbound ports from the internet, but I can still, using the Azure Arc agent, I can still connect to this virtual machine using Admin Center. I get the normal interface of Admin Center. I can install roles and features right from the Azure portal. I can even RDP into the server, again, without opening port 3389 on the firewall. This is all done outbound using the Azure Arc agent, which is pretty cool to do. So the final thing before we jump back to the slides is the preview feature I've talked about, which is Arc-enabled VMware vSphere. And in this situation, I've connected one of my VMware vSphere environments to Azure Arc. And if I open one of the servers, the VMs available here, this VM is deployed on VMware on premises. So this does not live in Azure, it lives on premises. And you can see here, I'm able to restart the VM, to stop it, to delete it, to start it. I can also add networking cards, and those networking cards are the ones available in my VMware environment. I can also add and remove disks. I can change the resources, CPU and memory. I can deploy extensions. I can do lots and lots of things to my VMware virtual machine. So as you can see, not only does this empower the developers, but as an admin, this allows me to seamlessly Arc-enable my servers and to just manage all of my VMs from one place. I don't need to go to different consoles and different portals and learn different skills. I can do everything I need from here, from the Azure portal. Okay, so jumping back to the slides and talking about the last part, which is regulatory and connectivity needs. As we've discussed, we're not migrating those resources to Azure. Those resources lives where you'd like them to live, whether on-premise or other clouds. So with Azure Arc, we're allowing you to meet your data residency and sovereignty requirements, so your data does not leave anything. There are some metadata that gets collected, but the actual data that lives on your servers are not transmitted to Azure, so your data is safe in your data center. We're simplifying the edge computing with Azure Arc. Again, you can have some very small infrastructure in your branch or remote locations. And with Azure Arc, you're bringing additional superpowers to those types of infrastructure. And finally, some of the Azure services like Azure Arc-enabled SQL and data services in general, they have fully or intermittently connected modes. So maybe your environment is not connected to Azure or the internet all of the time, which is not a problem. You can deploy this in a semi-connected mode. You're going to get some of the functionality, not all of the functionality, but again, you get a managed data services on-prem even without constant connection to the internet. Okay, so with that said, I've showed lots of demos and talked about lots of features. So how do you get started? How do you start testing out Azure Arc? If you'd like even to do the same demos that I've done, actually there is a very cool thing that I'm going to show you, that you can do the same and experience the same demos that I've just shown you with a click of a button. So the one thing that I would strongly encourage you, if you're interested in Azure Arc or a specific feature of Azure Arc that you'd like to test it out, is Azure Arc Jumpstart. And this is an open source project that allows you to have this supermarket experience. So imagine that you're interested in Arc-enabled SQL managed instance, and you'd like to do this on an OpenShift cluster. So if you go to the Jumpstart, you're going to see a scenario for data services on OpenShift cluster, and you're going to get automation to deploy this for you and configure Azure Arc so that you can explore the capabilities without having to deploy lots of things. All you need to have is an Azure subscription and you're going to find scenarios for most, if not all, of the Azure Arc services that you would be interested in. Also, there is something called Jumpstart ArcBox, which are the two VMs that I was using for the demo. Those are basically sandbox environments that come pre-configured with the applications that I've shown you, Azure Arc services, configuration, all of the GitOps configuration that I've shown, all of this is configured for you. And there is documentation on how to deploy and how to leverage and how to do the same demos that I've just shown to you today. So ArcBox is definitely something to explore. We recently had HCI Box. So if you'd like to also to play with Azure Stack HCI and deploy AKS and experience Resource Bridge and everything else with HCI, but don't know where to start, you can simply go there, deploy it, HCI Box, and you're going to get a full-blown Azure Stack HCI environment. There is also Jumpstart Lightning, which is a YouTube channel. You're going to find lots of videos with customers, with partners, with the Jumpstart team, explaining those scenarios and capabilities. And you're going to find lots of very good educational videos on Azure Arc. So talking a little bit about Jumpstart ArcBox. So as I said, it's a sandbox environment. There are at the moment 4 different flavors of ArcBox. So there is the full experience, which is ArcBox Full, and this allows you to experience Azure Arc enabled servers, Kubernetes, data services. So all of the demos that I've just shown are going to be deployed there. So you can simply find Linux, Windows, SQL Server, VMs, and Kubernetes cluster. All of them are connected to Azure Arc with all of the bells and whistles configured for you. If you need a slimmed down version of this sandbox, maybe you're just interested in Arc-enabled servers and SQL servers, we have ArcBox for IT pros, which is going to deploy a couple of Linux machines, a couple of Windows machines, a SQL server, and again, onboard them to Azure Arc and deploy monitoring and security. If you like the demo that I've done with Kubernetes and GitOps and the bookstore application, this is ArcBox for DevOps. So once you deploy it, you're going to get the same demo experience that I've just shown you with the documentation on how to configure and how to demonstrate those kinds of capabilities. And finally, ArcBox for DataOps. If you're a DBA, you're focused on the data services part, DataOps is the flavor for you to deploy. So just giving you an overview about how this looks like from an architecture perspective, and you're going to find those diagrams on the Jumpstart project. You can see here that you can use the Azure Portal, you can use Terraform, you can use Bicep. We have templates for any of those infrastructure as code tools, so you can deploy Azure ArcBox sandbox environment with those tools, and all of this is going to be deployed for you. As I mentioned, SQL Server, Windows Server, Linux, data services. So you're going to have Arc-enabled SQL managed instance, PostgreSQL. All of this is configured and deployed for you. So all you have to do is deploy it and then start experiencing and testing the Azure Arc capabilities. IT pros, again, it's slimmed down version focused only on servers, so you can see the servers that gets deployed and the Arc-enabled servers and Arc-enabled resources that will get deployed and onboarded for you, in addition to the services, the Azure services that sit on top of that. The DevOps flavor as well, you get 2 Kubernetes cluster and you have GitOps, Open Service Mesh, Key Vault extension. All of this, again, gets deployed for you. All you have to do is just play around with it. And finally, DataOps, which is going to deploy 3 clusters with SQL managed instance. You're going to get disaster recovery across 2 sites. You're going to get Active Directory authentication. You're going to get high availability. So all of the toys that you'd like to have in a sandbox environment to test and play and learn about Azure Arc, you can have them with a click of a button. And finally, this is HCI Box. It's still in preview, so you can deploy it only using Bicep, but you're going to get all of the bells and whistles for HCI. So you're going to be able to deploy Resource Bridge, create VMs on your Azure Stack HCI infrastructure, also deploy AKS on HCI, and deploy applications there, use GitOps there. So everything you would imagine to have on HCI box is got you covered. So finally, the last thing I'd like to share is this is the short link for Azure Arc Jumpstart. You can go there and start learning about Azure Arc. Visit definitely the documentation for Azure Arc, and there is a Microsoft learning paths for the different Arc servers that you can start consuming and learning about. So finally, thanks a lot for your time today. I know I've gotten through a lot of information, and thanks for the Festive Tech Calendar organizers and how they made things very easy and very cool, and all of the learnings that we got to experience and learn in the festive month of December. So thanks a lot for your time, and have happy holidays.